O que acende a sua vontade de começar algo? Tem uma faísca em você que te chama para empreender, investir, dar novos rumos para sua vida. E para todos os seus começos, você pode contar com Santander Select. Um banco mais pessoal, mais próximo, mais humano. Um time de especialistas com olhar atento para cada momento da sua vida. Porque você sabe, só quem já deu muitos passos está pronto para continuar começando. Santander Select. Começa em você, começa agora. Você que está aí ouvindo esse podcast e faz exercícios. Sei que você provavelmente bebe só água para se recuperar. Mas você sabia que a água pode não ser o suficiente para hidratar nosso corpo? Seja durante ou após a atividade? Ainda bem que chegou o Gatorade Zero.
Zero açúcares e com eletrólitos e vitaminas para te recuperar para a próxima rodada. Experimente o novo Gatorade Zero.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Jane Kinninmont, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to find a semblance of order in our mad, 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 mad world.
And one of the bright spots where we usually find that semblance of order is with a fan favorite, NATO. So fresh from her visit to the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., we are rejoined by our favorite Glaswegian, the returning champion, Jane, who will tell us all about how NATO orders the disorder, whether Starmer is standing shoulder to shoulder with Biden, and what is the positive mojo that the West can generate. Jane, look at you, fancy, fancy. You got to go to the 75th NATO summit. I have to convey a modicum of jealousy, although I was in Sweden, I didn't have the jet lag, and I had longer summer nights, so maybe not that jealous. But set the scene for us. Lots of men in suits, Northwest DC hotels crawling with security guards. What else?
So I've just come back from being part of the NATO Public Forum, which is the bit attached to the NATO summit where they bring together think tankers and experts to listen to the heads of state and foreign ministers that attend the NATO summit. And it's super high security. They block off all the roads around it, including with concrete slabs, but also vehicles. I was with some people I'd recently been to visit NATO in Brussels, and we were laughing because when we went to Brussels, the roads at that time were blocked by protesting farmers. And this was quite similar, except it was all obviously deliberate to keep the summit highly secure and highly visible.
What policy-relevant issues did NATO actually discuss?
This summit was really, really heavily focused on Ukraine. Some people said it almost seemed like a Ukraine summit called a NATO summit. That was the overarching issue. But also, it was really focused on sending a strong message, reaffirming the value of NATO, particularly to the US. So the whole event was shaped by the fact it was in Washington in the run-up to this hugely important American election. And most of what was said was really designed to appeal to an American audience, and particularly to appeal to a possible future President Trump, because increasingly people around the summit are thinking that that's the most likely outcome of the election. So you heard people again and again emphasising how much more Europe is spending on defence now, and the US will benefit from that, it was repeatedly said, including through American jobs. And there was a lot of references to sort of the historic grandeur of NATO and its role protecting the US even after 9/11. It was a very, very US-centric summit.
Yes, it is true that I would rather be in northern Sweden than in DC, and I don't even mind cold lake swimming in Dalarna or in Hagakusten, as opposed to very warm beach swimming in Norfolk or in Maryland or Delaware. But I have a little bit of professional jealousy What professional role of yours got you invited to this summit? I am the one between us who is the only senior analyst at the NATO Defense College Foundation. Yeah. And I was not invited. So what got you invited, and what other think tank players are there?
So whilst I was there with a group of experts that spent time over the last year writing a report for the NATO Secretary General on NATO's approach to the Middle East and Africa. And I recorded an interview with 2 other experts from that group. But really, there were some announcements made about the Middle East and Africa, but that was very far down the summit agenda. This wasn't a summit with a strong global flavour. It was Ukraine, it was the value of NATO to the US, and a little bit of discussion about the Indo-Pacific with the leaders of Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea all present. And so let's hear this interview now, which I recorded while at the summit. So I am in a freezing cold breakout room in Washington at the NATO Public Forum, and I'm delighted to be sitting down and conspiring with 2 of my friends and fellow experts from the group of independent experts on NATO and the South, which produced a report that fed into the summit. We've all been here for the public forum and various meetings around it, and so I'm keen to compare notes on what's been coming out of it. So I'm here with Élie Tenenbaum, who is the head of the Security Studies Centre at IFRI, the French Institute of International Relations. Hi, Élie.
Hi, Jane. Good to have you.
And also with Isabelle Werenfels, who is a senior fellow at the German think tank SWP.
Great to be here, Jane.
So I just want to start with the general impressions of this summit, the 75th anniversary summit here in Washington. It seems that the messages have been really well coordinated. And what do you hear as the key things that have been decided and discussed here over the past few days?
So definitely Ukraine has been on the top of the list of all the agenda, is probably taken more than half of
no,
the
more,
meetings.
three-quarters.
Three-quarters, yes. So it's definitely been the top message due to the military situation, but also a number of looming, options. I would say that China and the Indo-Pacific comes second with this idea of an increasing linkage between the strategic issues and definitely North Korean support to Russia in the context of the Ukraine war, etc. And China also supporting more and more at least the Russian war effort and the war economy is definitely been on the mind. And probably, unfortunately for us, I would say the South comes, really, really well after that.
I would say everything has been through the lens of Ukraine. Even when they spoke about the AP4, Indo-Pacific partners, it was in a way, how can we get them to support us in our fight? A second thing I saw that was, or I felt was really dominant, was democracies versus authoritarian states, autocracies. The value discourse was very strong, I felt, and that, of course, makes it again difficult for some of the partnerships. Exactly. Yeah. And, if I have to put it in a nutshell, I would say it was basically a summit on Ukraine against the backdrop of a looming Trump presidency, because that, I thought, was a message that came particularly from the Americans on panels to a domestic public. The war in Ukraine also means that we have jobs here. But I think that was one of the very strong messages. It's creating jobs here when we are selling arms to Ukraine.
It's interesting. The summit seems to be doing an impressive job of projecting unity and solidarity, but a lot of the conversations in the corridors and a lot of the media coverage is exactly about, is Trump going to be next? And is there any chance that Biden will come off the ticket? What kind of things have you been hearing in those unofficial, gossipy conversations?
The first day I felt Trump was a taboo. I felt what was also a taboo, speaking or mentioning political settlement on Ukraine. And what was also a taboo is mentioning the second big war in the region. Now, at one point, for every one of these topics, there was someone who broke the taboo. Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish prime minister, who spoke about the war in Gaza. But I think there was a lot of things not said because of this reduced message. But it's very clear that the idea of this reduced message was to be strong and get a long-term vision and a long-term commitment on Ukraine so it can't be derailed.
I think that, on the Trump question and about what NATO really is, and NATO is a consensus-based organization. And so they try, obviously, to sort of push aside every divisive questions. Gaza is definitely one among them, and Trump, in a way, is also another one. And so, it's taboo up to a point, maybe a bit strong, but certainly the fact that they try to push this aside and to focus on what makes them, as they say, stronger together, or, on what base they can build a consensus. And Ukraine is certainly today the subject where you have the most consensus. And as Isabelle was saying, the democracies versus autocracies is another aspect of the consensus. How you build a consensus. We can add more stuff about expanding industrial capacity, and strengthening transatlantic link. So I would say that the Americans on this side, and there have been a lot of American speakers, obviously, because this is the host nation here, has been trying to reassure, whereas irrespective of their political background, that America will remain committed to NATO, to European or Euro-Atlantic security, in spite of its Indo-Pacific commitments, in spite of political views or preferences that may come out of the next election.
But you asked about the corridors. And of course, in the corridors, the issue was Biden and not Trump. I thought that was very interesting, too, because Trump, everyone knows that may be looming. But then the question is, will Biden go? I think that was something people discussed. And if he goes, will it be Kamala Harris, or will the Democrats have some kind of open voting process on other candidates? And there appears to be a lot of things going on behind the scenes in Washington. And at the same time, there is no clear sign in which direction. That was my sense.
So, Élie, just before coming to Washington, you've been to Ukraine, and contrasting being there on the ground with being here, how do you think these announcements are going to land in Ukraine, and what sort of difference will it actually make to the progress of the war?
So, regarding Ukraine, there has been 4 elements from the summit that is interesting to highlight. One is the famous well-lit bridge to membership is definitely sort of a workaround fashion to say something else, which is exactly the same from what had been said 1 year ago at Vilnius, that there would be a revocable path to membership. So basically, nothing has changed, but the difference now is that Ukrainians had been warned months in advance that there would be no invitation to membership. The Americans certainly tried to lower Ukrainian expectations. Yes. Everything that comes after that well-lit bridge appears like a consolation prize, really something that, okay, you're not going to have the real big thing, the one security guarantee that will get you out of trouble, but you're going to have a lot of number of things. And the piling up of measures, of course, is good to Ukraine and is sort of appeasing up to a point the Ukraine dire military situation right now. But it is probably not enough. It's probably a disappointment to a lot of Ukrainian people. So what do we have? We have a financial pledge of 40 billion euros minimum worth of military support to Ukraine in the coming year. It may seem a lot. It's less than the actual supplemental package that was passed by the Americans. And it's certainly not enough to create the conditions for Ukrainian victory. They may be even debate if that is enough to cope with current attrition that is happening in Ukraine. But it's really about keeping Ukraine just above the water, but not really enough to come out of the water. Finally, and we just said that, so you have the prospect of a big policy change in the event of a Trump presidency, right. and it's on everybody's mind. In the corridors, I've been talking about peace deal. What would a peace deal would look like? What would be the security guarantees to Ukraine so that Ukraine would sort of accept that? What would be the political conditions in which Russia would be interested in a peace deal. Vladimir Putin certainly doesn't look like he's interested in a peace deal. And this has not been, obviously, in the final declaration. This has not been on the front stage, but this is more and more on everybody's mind.
And how does that compare to the conversations you were having in Ukraine? I mean, were people thinking, if Trump comes, things will have to change? Or
so, people in Ukraine that I met, again, it's divided. For some of them, it's still impossible to accept the sacrifices that have been done, the population who's still under occupied territories, the children who have been deported. All this is not something that you can, just make a deal over and say, move on and to save some taxpayers' money in the U.S. So some of these Ukrainians say, we will keep on fighting, and if we don't have U.S. support or even wider European support, we'll keep on fighting a different way. I have my doubts to the feasibility of such an effort, given the cost, the tremendous cost that had already been paid by Ukrainian people, but of course it will be up to them. Another part of Ukrainian society is now ready to consider, I feel, this idea. They're skeptical about the ability from the U.S. and other Westerners to convince Putin to maybe consider something that would be less than total, annihilation and unconditional surrender. But they are ready to maybe give a penny to say, okay, if you manage to get some Russians at the table at some point, we could contemplate something that would not require them to accept, not talking any peace treaty, not talking, any acceptance of lost territory, but just say, okay, maybe have a pause here, maybe have a sort of ceasefire, but that would need some serious security guarantees. And if these are not Article 5 NATO membership, then it would be some sort of South Korean style, or Kosovo style, boots on the ground, peacekeepers, peace enforcers, it's certainly something even stronger than peacekeepers, because we will need these peacekeeping troops to be actually able to fight in case of a violation of the ceasefire. Not blue helmets that would just look at Russians violate the ceasefire and say this is bad.
And turning to the other big war that we mentioned as well, I mean, as you say, Gaza has been really absent from the discussion, but we did hear the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, speaking about it. Do you want to say a bit more about what he's put forward?
Let me begin with the good news and then go to what I thought was rather problematic in the overall summit regarding the South. In the declaration, we have a paragraph, Article 32, in which I think it is signaled that there will be a continuous focus on the South, a stronger one, with an action plan that will be revisited. So I think that is maybe a stronger institutionalization of the relationship, a special representative, etc. So I think these are really important steps. And I think the Spanish Prime Minister made some statements that are just so obvious but so important and nobody else made, which is our well-being depends on the well-being of our neighbors. And I think this is also why particularly the southern allies are pushing for, closer relations with the southern partners. Having said all of this, I mean, Pedro Sanchez mentioned also the fact that the perception of double standards, not just the perception, really the different way of looking at international law and humanitarian law when it comes to Ukraine and Gaza, and what that causes among populations, but also governments in the South. And now this begins to bring me to the more problematic aspects. On the one hand, there was very little Southern representation. From what I know, there was the Bahraini and the Iraqi foreign ministers present. But what I thought was utterly remarkable, we have Blinken first, we have Lloyd Austin, we had Stoltenberg, we had Kallas, the Estonian Prime Minister, we had Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor of the U.S., we had Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark. None of them mentioned the South and the Southern partners at all. It was interesting that it was 3 Eastern Europeans that began to mention. However, not in a context so much of partnerships. We had the Czech president that mentioned them and said we also need to think of them. We had the Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski speaking about Africa as post-Ukraine war, possibly the biggest emerging threat. That was interesting, that it's for the EU to solve this,
not NATO.
Not for NATO, exactly.
EU neighbourhood,
so
EU
kind of
problem, in a way.
Yeah, and the division of labour, in a way. He said NATO, US to be somewhere else in other arenas. And then it was the Slovak president that mentioned G20 and BRICS. But it was only Pedro Sanchez that really spoke of partnerships. What was also interesting is that Iran was much more present. And very much as a threat perception, very much this whole axis of upheaval, as it was called here. So really the whole part of opportunities that partners also offer, and as security providers, as et cetera, all of that was basically not discussed.
Yeah, there have been a few mentions of the African Union, and I had a chance to ask the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, about the report and about what NATO could do. It was very interesting that she really flagged NATO and EU support for the African Union, common interests, and particularly a common interest in fighting terrorism. But then she also said, increasingly the fight against terrorism is the fight against Russia. But I am sure that is not how they see it in Addis Ababa, in the Chinese-funded building that the EU has. So it's not quite a common vision. And that's what we were trying to navigate with the report, really, how you deal with these really different worldviews.
I think NATO is finding hard to reconcile two realities with the South. One is what we're saying about North Korea, and this is certainly true about Iran, which definitely sort of climbed up in the ladder of the threats in the final declaration, now Iran. And this is linked to this sort of Ukrainian gaze at the global situation, and because Iran is supporting and delivering weapons to Russia, etc. So Iran scales up. And so this is a way for NATO to say, you see, the South does matter because these are the same people who are threatening us in the North, in the East, and now in the South. And in the same time, you have this principle that we sort of push forward in our own report of non-exclusivity, not forcing our southern partners to decide to choose between one partner or the other, that we're not going to lecture them.
Because they wouldn't listen.
Because they wouldn't listen. And because
they would turn away from us.
You turn away because you're lecturing, because you're patronizing, and because you're forcing them to sort of take sides, and in their perception, I guess, is, to sort of lock them up in a face-to-face with the Western powers that they feel have taken advantage of the relationship in the past, and now they are in the process of diversifying. So you have these two visions. Connectivity, this is all connected, and you cannot fight Russia only in the East while accepting it to make inroads in the South. But in the same time, you need to work with your partners without forcing them and without, engaging them in a new Cold War.
And to make it more complicated, you're working with authoritarian regimes, which again goes against this discourse, which was so strong, exactly, that we're working with our democratic partners, which is what I heard a lot now in this summit.
Yeah. Well, I just did an interview with an Indian news show, World in One News, and it was a window into another world that's kind of absent from here. But their take on the NATO summit is basically, why is NATO using the Cold War playbook 75 years later and spending all this money on missiles?
And what I found remarkable is there were these panels, there was a lot of talk about China, making inroads, supporting Russia, etc. But there was very little talk about why these countries are so popular in large parts of the so-called global South. And I think that was totally absent. Also, the idea of populations really becoming more and more anti-Western, partner governments having to deal with that. I mean, one of the reasons why Southern partners may not have been here, I think there are reasons from both sides. But from the Southern partner sides, it's of course Gaza. It's the populations that are just in uproar because of that, and I don't think it would go down well. And the other thing is that NATO, I think it would have made it very difficult for NATO, because it would have also shifted the focus a little bit more to the other big war that we're seeing at the moment. So I think both sides didn't really want this, and this is why the South was so downplayed here, except with this, I think, very important paragraph, as we said, and I think we all think positive because it reflects recommendations from our report, and there will be an action plan, unfortunately not public, but from what we gather, bits and pieces, there's going to be quite a bit of the recommendations on the South.
Thank you very much. I'll let you go. We all have planes to catch to our different countries, but it's been great chatting with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, for having us.
After the break, has the NATO summit helped order the disorder? Jane, getting back to the current summit, could it be an opportunity to more order the globe and to calm down tensions? And will the summit actually affect the war in Ukraine?
The announcements made at the summit will help Ukraine, but they won't be a massive game changer. A lot of it is about better organising and coordinating stuff that member states are already doing bilaterally for Ukraine. So it is important for Ukraine, but it's not something that's going to be decisive. Nobody, unfortunately, is optimistic that Ukraine is about to win this war soon. Everybody framed support for Ukraine as essential to upholding the global order, and that makes sense because this is a clear-cut case of one country aggressively invading the other. But beyond that, the summit didn't really deal with the global order, and it was particularly noteworthy. The war in Gaza was barely mentioned. Just a few individual leaders, like the Prime Minister of Spain or Erdogan from Turkey, brought it up, but generally I think it was publicly not mentioned because it was a divisive issue. Of course, leaders will have been talking about it behind the scenes, but it's not part of the narrative. It wasn't really a global narrative. We heard very, very little about engaging with the so-called global south, which seems usually to be a major feature of international summits and statements these days.
Do you think that this was a successful summit and the things that it's meant to do, deterring Putin and coordinating assistance to Ukraine, did the top table leaders get the job done?
The success of the summit is going to be judged really after the US election, because a lot of the point of this summit was about pitching NATO to the US and putting down arguments that would appeal to an America first President Trump. So really this was about trying to ensure that NATO continues to have strong American support after some months where there's been a lot of anxiety in Europe. One of the phrases heard quite a lot in the corridors was this phrase, Trump-proofing. How can Europe Trump-proof its security? And it's going to take some time to see, what is next. Of course, we don't know the result of the US election, but even before the recent assassination attempt on Trump, there was increasingly an assumption that if Biden stayed on the Democrat ticket, he wasn't going to win. The Democrats would not win. And really, so many of the discussions that I had in the corridors with the American think tankers were focused on US domestic above all else.
Do you think that this summit actually helped order the disorder in any way?
I don't think this is a summit that has changed very much. It's been good that the leaders were able to come together and there weren't any kind of big divisions. There wasn't acrimony between the member states or between the member states and Ukraine. There was a kind of ripple of discontent over Viktor Orban because he left the summit early in order to go to Mar-a-Lago and talk to Trump and say Trump is the man who will bring peace to Ukraine. So that was somebody breaking ranks, but in a way he's always a kind of permanent outlier within NATO and within the EU, so it didn't really take away from the core of the summit. But I don't think this is something that has significantly strengthened NATO. Everyone is still waiting with bated breath to see what happens in the US election. Nothing went wrong, but there's a kind of holding pattern now for the next few months.
And now, most crucially, I want to end asking about my main man, who I have my man crush on, Sir Keir. How do you rate his performance in his first major summit and actually first major international appearance as Prime Minister?
So, as usual, Keir Starmer isn't a hugely dramatic or charismatic person. I know that's part of what you love about him, Jason, but he was seen as a serious, a heavyweight, and a breath of fresh air after a period where Europeans in particular really haven't known what to make of British politicians. So the UK, I think, is trying to take some of the credit for this pledge for an irreversible pathway to NATO membership for Ukraine. He will have been happy with the outcome of that. But also just generally, everyone is really keen to meet a new Prime Minister with a massive majority who is likely to be a player for quite some time. And of course, this is also in the context of the French government having been suddenly weakened and plunged into uncertainty, where the UK is now emerging as one of the most stable-seeming countries in Europe, which is a refreshing change from the past few years. So Keir Starmer, David Lammy, John Healey were all there, and they were all hugely in demand in their first major international outing as a government.
Leslie, any final takeaways or any bloopers that you witnessed?
Well, you asked me about bloopers, and of course the obvious one came right at the end of the summit when Biden misspoke and called Zelensky Putin. And Biden has misspoken many times in his life, but at this time, when there's so much scrutiny, so much concern about his debate performance, this was something that did cast a shadow. And unfortunately, it's often just 10 seconds of audio or 15 seconds of video that reach most people out of these huge events. So NATO had brought loads of content creators, they had put on this huge public forum, they wanted to get all these messages out of the summit, and the one most Americans will have seen is a gaffe.
Well, that's it for this week. If you too want to help order the disorder and deter our enemies, you can tap follow right now, and you'll be notified when every episode launches.
Yep, and if you want to learn more about anything we've discussed, then you can subscribe to our Substack. It's completely free, and the link is in the show notes.
Our producer is a NATO-like orderer, and his name is George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern.
Thanks for listening, and hope you have an orderly week.